Russell, welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure. Nice to meet you.
It's totally my pleasure, and thank you for being accommodating. I know that we rescheduled a couple of times, but when I was reading about your life story, I thought it was fascinating. You are somebody who used to be a professional musician. You are CEO, you're a founder, you're an investor, you have podcasts, and you're a speaker. How do you end up building this fascinating life journey?
Um, that's a good question, actually. I think when I was very young, it was very clear to me that I was going to be a musician. And I think when you work at any sort of sport or profession or trade at a very high level at a very young age, it's obvious that where you're going to go. So I remember my parents saying to me, maybe you should have a fallback position, maybe you should take qualifications, maybe, which I did, maybe you should do this and that in case it doesn't work out. But from a very early age, probably 13 or something like that, 12, something like that, I knew I was going to be a professional musician. And I went to the Royal College of Music, and I'd been in the National Youth Orchestra in Great Britain, and had really sort of reached, a high level of expertise, really. I became a professional viola player, which is what I did. And for me, it was absolutely fascinating because my life was going exactly as I had envisaged it, and then realized that actually it was possibly not a career I wanted. And it is interesting for a lot of people who have achieved a lot of their life goals quite early. You actually go through a form of burnout where you get quite jaundiced about what it is that you've actually decided to do. So I got into the business side of music, and then it went into the business side of business, and I drifted around doing all sorts of different jobs. I worked in sales and marketing, and I worked in all sorts of worked my way around different sorts of industries, and eventually decided to have some therapy. And I know it's a very American idea, but it's not in Britain to have therapy. And I went to actually a career counsellor, and we actually sat down and planned out what I wanted for my life. And it's a very, I mean, I know now it was just part of transactional analysis, and we just did a career plan. And what Tom said, who was my mentor and therapist, he basically said, why not live the life you want and plan to get the life you want rather than just falling into things. And so we did a life plan and a life goal and a set of plans and a set of objectives and all that sort of stuff. And that was only about 12 years later, I sort of was feeling quite fulfilled and happy doing what I was doing at the time, and actually pulled out the planning that I'd done. And it was actually exactly the plan I'd put together. So it was almost as if the first part of my life was very much predestined and, driven around the talent I had. The second thing was contrived or created. And then the third thing was about actually, how do I think about my career rolling forward into my sort of third trimester? I don't know, trimester is a term, actually. I think it's to do with pregnancy, but you know what I mean. To the third stage of my life, which was about, in the last maybe 15 years of your working life, what are you going to do? And it's about building a portfolio career, doing different things. But it's also about not throwing away the things that you've learned. So I'm a business psychologist. I work a lot in that world. I'm a coach, I'm a speaker, as you say. But I always fall back on some of the things I learned in the music world. So for me, being in business, being in coaching and such like, is very rarely to do with sport. And yet most people talk about sport as a sort of precursor for coaching. But being in music is much more like being in business. So if I used to play in a West End show, and 378 performances of the same show one year, just relentlessly, night after night after night, at a good level, not making any mistakes, not being late, not being having to perform whether you wanted to or not, having to rock up whether you felt like it or not. I mean, that's not like sport, but this is like business. You're in a call center and you have to rock up every day. If you're unwell, you have to learn the resilience, the grit, the understanding, especially your world where you're dismissed on without any sort of protection really. And I found that everything I've learned in life actually obviously has built the person I am today. But I think a lot of people throw away the lessons they've learned in life and they don't really encapsulate and move forward with those things. And so my journey went from being a single river tributary into another tributary, and now it's like lots of little tributaries going in different directions. And I have a really interesting life. Every single day is different. So I work in academia. I work in in the corporate world. I work in charities. I'm a CEO of a charity. I'm a business mentor. I've worked with private equity houses. I've been a consultant. I bought a company. I sold a company. I've done all sorts of interesting things. Um, but like a lot of Brits, we're quite unassuming. We don't jump up and down and say, well, I know a lot of Brits do these days, but I'm not on LinkedIn every day saying, hey, look at this amazing thing I've just discovered. And hey, I just want to say how amazing I am. A lot of us Brits are actually, we just want to get on and do the job. And I always find that people who are posting those things on LinkedIn are usually not working that hard. So I'm usually too busy to faff about with that. But we find different things, don't we? I've found podcasting, and I found it really interesting because again, it was about performance. Did a lot of training, speaking in front of large groups, again about performance. And so a lot of those initial things I sought to replicate later on during my life, and I've landed a really interesting career for myself. I'm not the richest person in the world. I'm not the happiest person in the world, but I've got what I wanted, and that was great. In fact, actually, this weekend, just gone, I went to a friend's significant birthday party, and we were repping because I bumped into someone who used to work for me 30 years ago, and we were chatting away because she had her own company now. We're both working in the same area, and it's absolutely fascinating how life's arcs take you to where you want to be, and you either get what you want or you get what you're given. And it's actually a very, very simple process to get what you want rather than get what you're given. And so that's what I've always done. And whether it's business psychology, working with leaders or coaching, whatever it is, what I wanted was to trade in massive financial rewards for flexibility and freedom, because they're my key values. And I know if I want to go on holiday next week and jump on a cruise ship and do something, I will, and I can, and I may just do that. I probably won't because I'm busy next week. But and I think it's about, as I say, it's about constructing a life that you want to live with, whether it has meaning in it or whatever it might be. It's about that. It's about that one thing. For me, we only have one go at this, so we may as well make the best we have of it.
That is fascinating, honestly, fascinating, and there's so many threads I can pull from so many different things. You said, well, number one, you might not be rich financially, but you definitely live a rich life.
Oh yeah.
I don't know anybody who has more experience, more life adventures, or different things that I've experienced like yourself, and that's why when I learn about you, it's like this is such a fascinating person. I do agree with you with LinkedIn. I feel LinkedIn is one of low key toxic social media platforms where a lot of people boast about what they have done and then things like that. It's like just do the work kind of thing. But Russell, you said that at the age of 12, 13, you knew that you were going to become a musician and music was your thing. But at some point, whether it was like 12, 13 years later, or however long that was, you felt like, okay, this is not, I felt burnout. This is not what I want to do. And this is something that a lot of people experience, whether they are in their 30s or 40s or 50s, when they felt that when they were teenagers or even when they went to college, they had the life path. They knew where they're going and their career. And once they hit that wall, it's like, crap, I don't enjoy this anymore. They almost experience a life crisis because they don't know anything else. That's It's just almost like the entire world fell apart because now they need to pivot and do something else. How was your experience when you realized that you needed to pivot and try something else and leave behind what you thought you were going to do for the rest of your life?
Um, yeah, I mean, this is a well known thing for people who like sports people. So we have a sport over here. We call it football. I know you call it something else over in that
Uh,
strange part of the world that you live in.
we call it foot in Venezuela.
Of
We
course
call
you
it
do. You're
football. So
Venezuelan. Yeah, of
there
course
you
you are.
go.
My apologies. But
I
you'll
know.
see people who have achieved a high level in sport when they have to retire. They don't know what to do themselves because that has been their life, and to a certain extent, they've been physically institutionalized in a strange sort of way. You'll meet people who are in athletics who, for some reason, break their leg at maybe 2021. That's all they've known, and they didn't actually get the chance to achieve those goals. You'll get people who go into businesses and achieve huge amounts by the time they're 30, and they've achieved all they need to achieve by the time they're 30, and then suddenly they've got nothing left. So for me, I recognized that in the music world that I couldn't be as good as I wanted to be. Um, and I was doing everything. I was doing all the work I could do. So I was being a principal, a viola player of the big London Symphony Orchestras. I was in Western shows. I was doing sessions. I was doing chamber music. And I just sat down one day and I realized that being a professional musician consists of two states. One is being bored stiff, and the other one is being scared stiff. And, I just suddenly thought to myself, I've had enough of this. Now, the interesting thing is, I decided to make a change, and I still meet musicians who are still playing and they're still in that state. And they had themselves locked into a place where they couldn't change. They didn't change. They couldn't. They weren't allowed to change. And the idea of change, or pivoting, as you call it, is a quite a modern sort of thing. I mean, I'm from an era where people used to leave leave school or college or university, go into the bank and stay in one job for the rest of their lives. The idea of having as many careers as I had would, when I was leaving, school and college, would be a mad thing. So I remember my colleagues at the time saying, well, why are you leaving the profession? And I was saying, because I want something else. I want something that's different. And I also had people in my family who were working in the real world. Even now, I find it's really strange for me, um, having had all my formative years as a musician. I find it really weird on a Saturday not to be playing. It's like, well, I should be working today, and I should be working every single. It's lovely to meet you tonight because it's 8 o'clock at night, and this is a time I'd normally be, playing. And so much of my life, formative years were written down there. But I think what happens is you come to a point, if you decide that you can't be what you want to be, or you've achieved, or you've decided that you've achieved what you have achieved, or that you're happy with what you've achieved. I think the pivoting process comes naturally if you take responsibility and accountability for your own life. Now, I didn't know that's what I was doing all those years ago. What I decided to do was to make a change. I'm very creative. So the idea of actually doing something different wasn't frightening to me at all. The idea of stopping something and starting something else wasn't frightening to me at all. I knew I could. I mean, I remember sitting down and doing, and I found this in other people as well. I worked in the business side of music, fixing music and musicians and such like. And I went to a recruitment agent one day and they said, "Well, what can you do?" And I said, "I have no idea what I can do. This is what I've done." And they said, "Actually, what you do is a little bit like we do. We get groups of people together to produce events and all those sorts of things. Would you go out and do an assignment for us?" I said, "Sure." So they sent me off to a vehicle manufacturer, and I sat down and said, "Well, what do you want to do?" And I said, "I've got no skills at all." They said, "Well, look, here's a phone, and here's a bunch of vans. Ring up all the restaurants in London and see if they want to buy some vans." And I said, "Okay, who do you talk to?" You just say, "Speak to the most important person you can get through." Now, in those days, the internet was like on pieces of paper that were nearly all yellow, and we had to run our fingers down and find the French. So it's a French company. You have to find the French terms. I had to ring them up, and I was ringing them up, and I sold 40 vans. And they looked at me afterwards and said, "Do you realise that no one can do that?" And I said, "Do what?" He said, "Do what you've just done." I said, "Well, I didn't know it was difficult, but now I know it's difficult. I don't know if I can do it again." And I think there's something about the human condition, which is how we frame our skills and how we frame who we are and our identity and such like, is so both limiting and transformative that we have to be careful how we see ourselves. But I went into sales and marketing, and that's sort of what I've done. And of course, it's no surprise, isn't it? Music's a form of communication, as is words. And if you can communicate a story or a message or a feeling or an emotion or a concept using a musical instrument, I mean, using words is a damn sight easier. I'm not sure I've answered your question, but I had a
No,
lovely
no,
answer.
no,
I enjoyed my answer.
no, 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 totally. Because it's true, and because the initial question was, how do you take it, the whole transition thing? But you felt, okay, this is my next step, and it gives even more value, more props, even more impressive what you did, because as you mentioned, this pivoting, this changing in careers is a modern world thing. Now people are changing every 2 3 maybe five
Yeah.
years Burnout comes a lot quicker than it used to be in the past, and the fact that you did that when nobody else was doing it, and not following what everyone else was believing the norm. You said, no, I don't want that. That is mad impressive and fascinating. But also what you said about the communication and the mindset thing is like those limiting beliefs we have, those are stories we have told ourselves from even, I think, the stories that our brain created even against our will when we were on our formative years, right? Without our consent, we were not even aware that those things were being implemented in our brain.
Yeah.
How do we realize it? Because here's the thing, as you said, nobody could sell like 40 bands to all these people. For you, it's like, well, I didn't know it was that hard. But if somebody had told you you should sell 100, then you probably would have sold more. But the fact that in your case, you were not aware until somebody pointed out to you that that's not the normal behavior, that's what keeps a lot of people from either reaching their potential or even just being in a very small box that they're unable to get out of it. How do those people can create the self-awareness needed and get out of that box and just break those barriers that we impose on ourselves?
Um, I think some of it's a very complicated question we're asking. It could take me 3 weeks to give you a good answer, but let me just give you some sort of answer. Um, but could I just before I do, could I? Well, the first thing is to answer your question is to say, well, everything in life is a choice, and once we become adults, we actually gain the power of choice. And I think a lot of people don't understand that. So they're defined in their 40s and 50s by the upbringing they had when they were children. I mean, profoundly affected by that upbringing. I can't say that word for some reason. Age of 23-ish, prefrontal cortex is fully matured. We are able to make choices for ourselves, and we choose to be defined by the parenting and the experiences we had when we were children. Now, some of those parenting and experiences are quite traumatic. Some of them are quite horrible. People have gone through all sorts of different things, and they arrive in front of me in therapy sessions, and you sit and talk to them about them, and they have been affected. But a lot of people are defined by them, and that's the difference. So we can choose to change the narrative of our lives because actually we can choose to rewrite our lives in the way that we want to. That sounds very glib, but it's actually really, really true. Every single day we're making choices about who we are, how we live our lives, and what we do next, and how that will work, and such like. Every single thing is a choice between something and something else, and we can be defined by what we've had and the choices we've made before, or we can choose to learn from those and move forward. People who've had terrible experiences as children can be crippled by those experiences, or can choose to learn from them and move forward, and actually have that as part of the richness of their lives. And you meet people whose lives have been destroyed by an event that's happened years ago, and it's an uncomfortable fact if you think about accountability. Is sometimes they've chosen to destroy their own lives. Now that is also a psychological phenomena, which is part of how we define ourselves in our own heads. But in order to pivot, you have to be aware that you need to make choices. I think for me, what was interesting is from a very early age, I was a big reader. I used to love reading, and I remember at the age of 6 or 7, I was reading books that I shouldn't have been reading, which were much older than my age group, and and that gave me a good vocab, and it gave me a really different perspective, and I was reading all sorts of bits of literature. And of course, in the time when I was thinking of leaving the music profession, musicians are very, very good at self-awareness and being in touch with their feelings and emotions, because you have to understand yourself to be able to communicate. So that was an advantage I had. And of course, I was reading self-development and personal development books because, hey, we would, because we're musicians. We were doing things like Alexander technique and breath work. Now it's a big thing. It's meditation. We do better. My goodness, we were doing that. I was doing that 40 years ago. 40 years ago, I'm not that old. 30 years ago, and that was just part of who we are. It was about how we managed. We were working with Louise Hay and people like that doing dietary stuff all those years ago. I mean, it's the modern generation always think they've invented everything, but we were all doing it beforehand. We just didn't give it a fancy name. We just did it. And so I think the power of reading, the power of perspective allowed me to sit down and say, well, look, I'm going to learn from this. I'm going to read this. I'm going to take some things. One of the things I read first was NLP, and I remember reading some stuff on NLP. I mean, I know a lot of NLP is being heartily rubbish now, But back then, it was quite an interesting way of thinking about the world. And that gave me some tools. And of course, once you have tools to make choices, then you can make those choices with a degree of education, I suppose. And then I started to better myself, and I got business qualifications. I did an MBA. That really woke me up for things like strategy and planning and thinking about business and such like. And then I've done doctorates, and I've worked in further education. I've got fellowships and such like. And all the way through my life, I've had a desire, a love, a need for learning. And I think if you have that at your heart, at your core, you can make any choice, you can make any pivot you want. And I'm always impressed by you look at Tim Ferriss and all these other people, they'll blithely be handing out book references and this and that and such like. And I do think there's a correlation between the people who are well read and the people who are well choiced in their words. And I think that's really important. And I genuinely don't think it matters what you read. I think the process of reading itself is really important. One of the things I've turned to quite recently, I know this sounds weird, is fiction, because we know that reading fiction is great for anxiety management, because the cortisol release sort of triggers into action slowly when you're reading, because you lose yourself and your brain switches off. And it's also about that conscious management of one's physiology. So having been a psychologist for many years, I've been working really hard at physiology recently, because it's been part of my latest learning project. And again, for me, it's that constant need to learn, that constant need to think, to ruminate, to create, to reflect, to transform. And that's all part of communication. Maybe that answers the question a little bit.
Actually, a lot. Because here's the thing, and I have people in my life that I'm trying to help them go through this thing, right? It just create more self awareness, understand better. I've always had like a decent level of understanding where a lot of my choices have come from, and what I want to do with my life, where my anxiety comes from, depression, all of that. But I'm a book nerd. I read a lot. I love reading, whether both fiction and nonfiction, self-development books. I'm all for it. And I've always been like that. Well, at least since I was age 11, 12. But most of these people that I know that are somewhat in my life, they haven't done that. And you saying that the power of curiosity, of reading and always learning, it gives you a different perspective, and it allows you to be more in touch with your internal self, and not only with your emotions, but your own thoughts, and create that awareness that it feels that a lot of people need, but they don't tap into it because they have a lot of distractions on their phones, whether on social media or other forms of entertainment.
Hmm. I think that's right. I think there was a guy called Howard Gardner many years ago. Again, at a discredited theory now, but at the time he talked about these different multiple intelligences, and how it was interesting blending these different things, and how you get an advantage from working with these different types of different types of intelligences. So one is musical. So, and that makes sense to me. And I meet a lot of people who are in their 80s who have incredible intellectual facility because of that, the neocortical stimulation, the grey matter stimulation. Same with dancing. The bodily kinesthetic intelligence. Now, when he was talking about these multiple intelligences, he wasn't talking about them in this way, but actually, strangely enough, what he identified were the intelligences that keep us young, give us a unique advantage. And I think, creating self-development around those things is interesting. A lot of people talk about self-awareness, but what they don't talk about is self-management. And actually, you can sit on the top of a mountain and have the most awareness, but if you don't actually put anything to action, you're not going to achieve anything. And I remember years ago, I remember chatting to someone who was one of these, sort of gurus, and they're saying, what I asked what they were doing. They were sitting in an office, and the office was quite empty. And I said, "What are you doing?" And they said, "I'm manifesting, and I'm sending out positive vibes into the atmosphere." And I said, "Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that." He said, "I've got a mood board, and I've visualized, and I've done this, and I've done that." I said, "Fantastic." He said, and I said, "How's it going?" He said, "Oh, I don't seem to have any money." I said, "Have you made any business calls? Have you picked the phone up and talked to anybody?" And he said, "Oh, that's not my part of my plan. Because if I manifest and I visualize and I put positive energy into the universe, then the universe will look after me." So we sat down, and after punching him gently in the face, intellectually, we chucked all that in the bin and said, "Well, actually, let's work out your goal and let's work out a plan, and let's actually figure out what levels of productivity you're going to bring to things." And then he did self management, and he did self management having been self aware first. and and it's one of those challenges. You've got self management and self awareness is like a seesaw. You have to build them both at the same time. And I think a lot of people chase the pixie or the intellectual pixie of self awareness without thinking that sometimes you can have a little less self awareness and a lot more self management. You can sometimes be much more successful. But hey, self awareness is groovy. So that's why we need to talk about it all the time. And I've made a feature of trying not to chase the intellectual fads. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it, at the moment? And you must see this because you're a much younger man than I am. And 3 weeks ago there was a product, and now that product has incorporating AI, and now it's a better product. I mean, it's just baloney. Because what all marketers do is we always say this, don't we? All marketers destroy everything for everybody. And what we don't do is we don't figure out actually what the thing is. What is it we're trying to do? What's sometimes the least sexy thing, which actually is the thing that just works over and over and over again. And there are some things in business and in life which just work, and they're the things you need to do. And you listen to people like Gary Vaynerchuk, like love him or hate him. A lot of people do both at the same time. I always think it's quite interesting. But many years ago, he used to talk about the power of work, and that's fascinating. And I always say to people when they look at me and say, "But you do virtually nothing," I said, "But when I work, I can probably work in a much more concentrated, focused, and much more effective way than most people. So my 3 hours is the equivalent to your 2 days because I've learned to work. That doesn't mean you have to work all the time. It means to work that when you turn your attention to it, it's something that actually generates a really useful output. I'm one of those people that loves a deadline, and especially when I'm doing lots of boring work. So this week I've been doing boring work. So you almost tease yourself up to the point where how because you're stimulating your cortisol to get your creative juices going. How close to that deadline can I leave it? Famously, a colleague and I once did a training course where we rocked up to the training course, and we didn't know what the course was. And they said, well, the course is this. And so we delivered the course. And we both got great feedback because actually we're able to, because we'd done the work, because we knew the subject. But the energy comes from being able to do what a musician does, which is to improvise in the moment. So you see, for me, I have this lovely background that allows me to be able to bring all those facets from music and put them into my business life. And for me, that's why any parent should give their children the opportunity to learn instruments, dance, to have any form of the creative arts. You really do get to know yourself. I mean, we used to know about neurodiversity when we were in the music profession many, many years ago, because we used to have those people with the genius gene, it's called autism now, or neurodiversity. We've known them for years because they're in the music profession. And then, how many musicians do you know who are great maths wizards? The answer is lots, because they're both forms of language which are, interlock in certain sorts of ways. It's all been there for years, and so I think musicians have had a head start for many years. And I hadn't really thought about that much before tonight, actually. But it's funny how much music has affected me.
You know what? It's just you hear a similar thing from anybody who has done something that requires a lot of discipline, a lot of structure, a lot of practicing and learning and doing the same thing over and over and over and over, whether you're
Yeah,
an athlete or you're a musician. That, especially if you do it from like an early age, that gets in your, I wouldn't say DNA, but it just comes second nature, and that is fascinating. And what you're saying is actually true. Sadly, I never went to a dance class or a music class, or just or I never picked up any instrument. I think that I don't have any musical whatever
you don't have to.
ear. Yeah, I guess it was never my interest. But when you're mentioning and when you're telling your story and all the things that you have been able to do and accomplish thanks to music. Even when you're saying about that, people say that you don't do that much work, but then your 3 hours equals like like a 2 day work that period for a regular person. I read a book years ago called Deep Work, called Newport. Fascinating how we
Absolutely.
just need to focus on that. But that came, I think, even from music, because you're not going to be practicing an instrument for 8, 9 hours, 10 hours in a day. You just do it on small sessions, like a burst, like a sprints kind of thing, like an hour, 2 hours, or 3 hours, and that is total fascinating. Now, what you mentioned about that guy who was trying to um, uh, was sitting in a room having all these positive energies and the room, you see that a lot lately. Yes, it's good to have those things, but you actually, as you said, you need to put the work. Is you're not as, life would be much easier if we could all sit around on the floor and expect life, universe, God, whoever bring us
Mm,
all of this.
mm,
But your self management, I think, is even more fascinating, because a lot of people, including myself in the past, we get caught up in the mental masturbation thing. We're too
mm.
aware, we know, and we are intellectually stimulated by ourselves. And then we don't do anything with it. We just keep thinking about it, and we feel productive by doing so.
Yeah. Yes, there's again, going back to many years ago, any psychologist will know transactional analysis and the five ego states of and one of which is try harder, and the idea, and of course, it's now redefined as ADHD in some places, but this idea that we see trying as being the output, whereas actually trying is just the input. But and it's really interesting in language. So, for example, in our culture, there's a phrase that says, "If at first you don't succeed, try again." That doesn't mean, instead of saying if at first you don't to succeed, do it differently and make sure it works. And it's this idea, and if you, it's really fascinating. We do these exercises all the time in the English language. We'll pass someone a pen and say, "Try, take it off me," and they'll take it off you and say, "No, that you didn't try." So they'll try and not take it off you, and they say, "But you haven't taken it off me." And so try is one of those funny words that really means I'm not going to do it. And managers will have this conversation. I've seen this happen so many times. You'll sit down with an appraisal as the coach, if you're sitting there watching it, and the person will say, "Okay, so these are my goals. Yeah, I'll try really hard to do those." And the manager goes, "Oh, fantastic. That's great." You sit down 3 months later and they come in and say, "Did you do it?" "No, but I tried really hard." "Oh, very good then." Because the measure of success was trying and not doing. And I think it's one of those things. Language. So I would say this as a behavioral psychologist. Language is the window to understanding people. It's the narrative, the patterns they build, which they talk about and reveal them from themselves all the time. Parapraxis is such an important thing to understand. Those Freudian slips that people drop out. They're there for a reason. They're clues as managers and leaders and communicators to be able to understand what's really going on in someone's head, along with the sort of micro expressions. If you can understand those two things, you've got the power to really read people. So then we're not just doing self-management and self-awareness, we're now doing others management. We are now being able to understand how other people tick. And we've got 2/3 of you know, what we talked about many years ago as emotional intelligence, which now has been hijacked to mean something else totally different, which is marketing for you, isn't it? That's what we lead.
Yeah, yeah. No, what you
I mean,
said,
another
right?
thing about
Deep,
marketing, just let me
uh-huh.
leap in for a second.
Yeah, go
So
for
let me
it.
pick up on something you said earlier. So there's a phrase in the English language called semantic degradation. So that means that words lose their meaning over time, as you know. And I often find people who don't speak the English language first often understand these phrases because they come from Latin or often. And so you got that straight away because I could see you nodding your head there. What that means is, we used to talk about stress as being something. Stress is meaningless now. No one knows what stress is. I mean, people tell you that stress is an emotional condition. It's just not. And now the newest thing, which is the subject of semantic degradation, is burnout. And actually, burnout is a serious thing. It's a workplace issue. It's not, and it has lost its meaning. And I'll meet people who say, "I'm working all these hours and I'm burned out." I said, "Well, you're not. You're not actually suffering burnout. Let me work through the symptoms of burnout. Have you got these?" "No." "Well, actually, you haven't got burnout." But what we do is we fancy a bit of burnout. And I think we have to be really careful as people in the personal development space that we're actually dealing with what is, rather than just what you said earlier, what's imagined or what's trendy or what's, I fancy one of these conditions. I haven't had one of these things. Now I work a lot with people who suffer extreme gender identity dysphoria. So, and often maybe even gender confusion and change genders and all that sort of work. And they're very clear about who they are because they're not the person that they present as the outside world. And so they have complete surety of who they are. And they really know themselves well. And it's actually quite fascinating to talk to people about identity and what people see as identity. And you'll find out a lot about a person when you say, who are you? What's your identity? Describe to me who you are and how you are. And it is really quite fascinating as you start to learn more about people, how people relate to themselves. Because once you've met someone who's gone through that sort of process, it's really fascinating to throw into the air all the stereotypes you know about the human condition. And hey, what could be more interesting in a learning sense than meeting someone who knows themselves so well they know they are not who they appear to be? Isn't that amazing?
That question, I don't think many people, including myself, have asked. They don't ask themselves, "What's your identity?" Outside those people who have when they feel from a different gender, outside those people who clearly feel that they're not in the right body, or they're a different person. But even as the either you and I, or just our friends or parents, whatever, if you ask somebody, what's your identity? What defines you? A lot of people just go towards what they do for a living, work. They don't. I think that because when you were mentioning the story, I was just asking myself, I was like, wait, hold on a second. If I ask myself that question, and the reality is like, not really. And we get caught up in these stories. So it's like, okay, what I do for a living, that should be my identity because that's what I do, you know, or whatever, 40% of my time or 50% of my time in a week. But then at the same time, when you were mentioning about how words lose meaning, is that we hear the next trendy thing, oh, that's what I am, or that's what I have, or that's what's happening to me, without truly understanding what's the meaning behind the word, and do you actually feel identified with that particular thing. Call it stress, call it burnout, call it depressed, call it ADHD, or whatever, call it anything. And you hit the nail on the head, and it's fascinating because we don't think about it that much.
No, and then and it's not a surprise really that we don't, because we're usually far too busy just getting on with our lives. And it only comes. I remember reading a work of fiction many years ago by a guy called Robert Rankin, and he writes a peculiar form of mad science fantasy books. And he was talking about in our lives, we have tiny moments of actual reality. And they're completely shocking moments of reality when we suddenly notice where we are and who we are and where we are at that given moment of time in our lives. I don't mean physically. And then he says the rest of the time we're just in the humdrum, we're just living and getting on with things. But it's about how do you create those shocking moments of reality? How do you create those more often? Because they're the moments where you pivot. They're the moments when you transform. And they're the moments where learning really takes place. And I mean, and I remember reading that book and actually at that moment had a shocking moment of reality because, of course, reading that really stimulated it for me. And at the time, I was going through a divorce and I was going through all sorts of different things. And so, I was emotionally more wrought and on edge. I'd actually just gone through a workshop at the time as well, which is really funny because one of my colleagues I met on Saturday, we were all having a laugh. And we were talking about levels of self-awareness. And I sort of blithely sat down and said, I think I'm very self-aware. And everybody in the room just laughed. I was thinking, what? But what the tutor told me is said that people, so, I won't, let's not go into that too much more. But what's fascinating is those shocking moments of reality suddenly are the things that define you. And I think you meet lots of people who go through life and have never had one. So they've just been defined by just what you said there, that social identity. What you'll do is you'll say, hi, Hi, Fred, who are you? And say, my name's Fred, I'm an accountant. That's what they say. Or they'll go, hi, my name's Esmeralda, and I'm a mom. And their identity is socially constructed. And then, surprise, surprise, the kids leave home and everyone has these identity challenges. Someone loses their job and they have these massive identity challenges. And I don't think we think enough about identity. And it really makes me laugh, actually, because ages ago I talked about NLP, and they used to have an iceberg. It was really clever and before its time. It was actually, a lot of the ideas were sort of appropriated from one of the big psychologists and hypnotherapists of earlier times, but they used to have this grid of dropping down, values and beliefs and all that sort of stuff, and at the bottom was purpose and identity. And I think what's been fascinating for me is going back and really thinking about those things. For me, the other way around, it's purpose and then identity at the very bottom. And I think you can be who you want. Isn't that, and how liberating is that? And do you know what's fascinating? Is I work with people who are 18, 19, 20, and they might have a polygamous relationship. They might have a neurodiverse condition. They might have all forms of intersectionality. And you know what? They're not bothered, because they're just more comfortable with themselves. And this current generation are so much more comfortable with themselves. And then the previous generation are moaning about the fact they don't do this, that. And you say, what's the previous generation? Well, you parented them. It's your fault. If you're not getting what you want,
Yeah,
stop moaning. Stop moaning at the next generation. But the current generation have this enormous plasticity. And I think it's going to be, assuming we're not all going to be in the massive war with China and Russia soon, that I think, the next 20 years for the human condition is going to be absolutely fascinating. I mean, I think we're going to win the arms race between us and AI, but no one seems to think that, because we've already decided that we're going to lose. So, there you go. I wonder why.
Who knows? Who knows? But what you're saying is absolutely true, and I see where you're coming from in a way. Is that a lot of these people that have polyamorous relationships, or they are, whether they are transgender or members of the LGBTQ or whatever, all these different things that used to be judged a lot, and even till this day, you still have some judgment. For them, it's like, I'm going to be judged anyway. I might as well just choose something that is valuable to me, identity, and I don't have to attach to what I do. As you said, a mom, an accountant, a business owner, because that's what you do. And the moment somebody takes that away from you, you don't know what to do. It's like if you had told yourself, I'm a musician, that's my life, and then at the age of 20 or 30, oh, that is no longer on the table, not because somebody took it away from me, just because it's not what I wanted to do anymore. So, and I think that is where I need to reflect a lot about how I view myself, and how I identify myself, not based on what I do, but based on what I feel and what I
Who
want
you
to
are.
do in life. Exactly.
Yeah, and I think what's really interesting, because we're going through this pivot point at the moment in Western society, aren't we? We've come from a world where we had very close families, we had very strong identities, we knew who we were, we knew where it all sat. I mean, we see with what's going on in America at the moment. I mean, women are sort of exercising their rights, and you see the men pushing back and pushing them back into the kitchen, and then the women exercising rights again. I mean, you nearly had a female president. That was never going to happen. It's much more important that you have a man as president than it would have to have a competent woman, because actually, over there, women's rights are really knocked down compared to other parts of the world. I mean, I know we shouldn't say that, but it doesn't matter who you are. You've got to be able to be, you've got to be able to fight your own journeys. You've got to be able to collect together. And, the role of women is in the world is horrendous in some places, because we used to have these strong, tight families. There used to be patriarchies. We used to have capitalism, informing what we did and how we're going to go. And we really need to really think about the structures of society, because actually what's going to happen is the current system we have is just unsustainable. It just really is. When you start to think about it, I listen to people like Elon Musk and all these big leaders, and they're talking about how much money they earn. And I just think to yourself, you've got, you might have 10,000 people all earning less than the minimum wage, and you're a billionaire. And put those two things together for a second. you know, there's a lot of people, there's a very small number of people getting rich off people's backs. Now, I've always been a capitalist. I've always been very happy with the concept. But I think sometimes as you get older, you start thinking, I wonder if this is what it's just all about. Why are we insanely driven, especially in your country, to just being to working 3 jobs for minimum wage for nothing really, to have no quality of life? I mean, what's that about? Why are you all driven to be entrepreneurs now? Which for no reason, because a lot of people just aren't entrepreneurial and they should just be having jobs. But because we're all sort of exploited, because we're all sort of underpaid. The very, very best way to make a country wealthy and increase work outcomes, to increase productivity, to produce life satisfaction, is to pay people a lot more money. And you look at the Scandinavian countries, and that's how it happens. Why are they always top of the list? They pay more, they get paid more, they invest more, and they get more back. And they don't have all this. They have fewer suicide risks, they have lower mental health problems, they have less problems with teenage pregnancies. Every social indicator is better. Now, something's going to have to give. It's interesting, isn't it? And I think what will happen over the next 20 years is, once you get the next presidential term out of the way, let's hope it's whatever it is, it's sensible. There's going to have to be some social reconstruction, and it will come with the fall of the American empire, which has gone, it's gone from zero to gangbusters to zero. It will go back down to zero very quickly, because that's the way the empires grow and fall very quickly. And I think we're going to have to reconstruct, because we're going to have a Chinese model inflicted on us if we're not careful, or hopefully a Japanese model. That's quite interesting if you've spent any time in the Far East.
Japanese, I see it hard. The Japanese have their own issues with
Of course,
a very
yeah,
aging population. China has been very quietly just gaining ground on all the African countries and all that. They're
yeah.
putting a lot of investment, a lot of things. One belt, one road, all of that. It's just China is being more about, see it's always the power structure. So China wants to compete with the US economically, Russia wants to compete with the US when it comes to the military, the arsenal, the just power itself. But as you mentioned about the American culture, the hustle culture in America has always been fascinating. To me, I'm guilty of that as well. I'm somebody who, I don't know if it's just because I grew up in a household where my dad back home used to work every single day, and that is, to me, that's a new normal, and I fit right in perfectly in this country. But I do have a lot of friends and family members in Europe, and they have a total different lifestyle, and they don't understand how people here can live just like going like a million like 1,000 miles an hour, not stopping and always feeling they're not being productive enough.
It is fascinating. If you look at the rise of leadership thinking over the last 30 years, and the rise of engagement, and just the concept of engagement. Why do we have engagement? The idea of engagement is that people can work harder than the amount of money that they're paid. That's what engagement is. So what we're doing is, what we're saying is, we'll train leaders to exploit the workforce. Now, of course, what the leaders don't realize is they're being exploited as well. So as long as we're all on this hamster wheel of exploitation, um, and as long as no one notices, we're fine. This week has been fascinating in the UK, because we have election week, election 6 weeks. So we've got the sort of madness you have, but for a much shorter time, thank God. And our wonderful Prime Minister announced this week this concept of national service, which is a very old idea. The idea of having a sort of home guard, military sort of thing. And Rishi Sunak, who's our Prime Minister, is a multi-millionaire. He comes from a family of multi-millionaires in India or something. I mean, they're a company that's still trading with Russia, although we're supposed to not mention that, so don't put that out live, because the bots will be after you. And he talked about national service, and he said it's time that the British people remember that they have a duty of service. And you just think about that for a second, you think, good God, the top 1%, that's what it's all about for them. And, we have to think about different systems of government and different ways of thinking about democracy. If we want to cherish our rights and our freedoms, we have to start with our own countries. And, Your country's losing its freedoms for various people, left, right, and centre. Mine's starting to. The Europeans are starting to lose their freedoms, and if we all end up like China, that would be great. But at least China's successful. But I mean, a lot of these tin pot dictatorships which are appearing are not necessarily. And I think, isn't it Argentina down your old neck of the woods? It's a bit exciting at the moment, and
Yeah, they have, and coming from, I wouldn't say communism because we never experienced communism. Even so, we experienced something far worse than communism, because communism will never work anywhere. It is impossible to work. But Argentina experienced that with the Kirchners back in the day, and then now with the new president, which is more far right than be a lefty. You see a lot of changes, and you see a lot of how the economy is somewhat improving, and people are much happier. What I see now, what is happening in Europe, what is happening in the US is, I would always be more right to, I would be more inclined to be on the right than on the left side. And that's just my personal opinion. But what I've seen is it's been so much abuse the from capitalism that have been to an extreme that now people are trying to have an overcorrection and now just throw all of it on the left, which it creates this issue where everyone wants uh, to be everything equal when clearly it's not working, and creates almost like a nationalist feeling. I think that part of it, of defending your own country, defending your own culture, defending your own thing, is what got you guys in the Brexit whole deal, when it was pitched in a way that it was purposely intended for people to misunderstand what it was intended to do.
of course, and you play on fears of people who have brown and black skin, and you basically hoodwink. And a lot of people who vote for Brexit absolutely believe the stories. And there's only one type of lie that works, and it's the big, 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 big lies, and that's what we're all hearing. You're hearing them from your areas over there, and we're getting them over here. But we're way off the subject now of of
Yeah,
psychology,
yeah,
and I need to be
I know.
respectful.
No, no, see, totally. And just to close with that one, say that somebody said you tell a lie big enough, loud enough, and long enough, and everyone will believe it,
Yeah,
right? And that person was Hitler. Hitler
that's
said
right.
that phrase.
Yeah,
So that's what's happening. And again, Russell's been enjoying this conversation a lot, and I wish we could go for
me
more
too.
hours because you're a very, very interesting person. But as a closing question, right? What is the greatest gift that another human have given you?
I mean, I don't want to be glib and say life, but that's pretty important.
Okay.
I could say I have a fantastic wife, and I think that's really important. And it's not my first wife; it's the second wife, and I think the greatest gift I have is having her in my life. I think because I think a lot of men are like this. A lot of men need the steadying, calming influence of someone. I often think men are like sort of little asteroids and comets whizzing around, and then women are sort of the planet that sort of anchor us, steady us and such like. And yeah, and then after that, whoever invented the first cruise ship, because I mean that's really important as well.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. I mean, if you outside the Titanic, then we're all good, right?
Listen, I mean, everyone has to learn a lesson, don't they?
Yeah, that's
And I
true.
would, and I mean, the thing is, you start now. I'm thinking about the question. I'm thinking, well, there's Bruckner and there's Mahler and there's all the musicians. But I mean, let's just
Yeah,
stop there. I think if my
stop
wife,
there.
if I'm going to cover my options, say
Okay,
I'm going
okay,
to say to my wife, and that if she listens to this, then she'll be very happy, and that's great because
okay,
she'll
okay.
cook me some lovely food.
There you go. There you go. No, beautiful, beautiful. And it's true. We need as men that anchor. That's what keeps us, grounded to some extent. It was it gives us a perspective. They have a much better or much higher emotional intelligence than we do, and that's a whole different topic that hopefully in the future I can talk to you about, because that was another topic I was really interested. But
Well,
yeah,
just to
uh-huh.
sort of tease that episode, then that's not
Okay.
factually correct at all.
I know. Oh, really? It feels
Mm,
like okay.
I know,
That's
I
that's
know, and that's
oh,
and that's really fascinating. So
You,
so anyway, let's close on that, and then
yeah,
maybe we'll pick that up at
yeah.
another time.
So, Russell, where can people find you if they want to listen to your podcast or just work with you or just know more about what you're
Sure.
doing right now?
So the best place to look for me is my company, which is QED, and the website is qedod.com, and you can email me at russell@qedod.com. There was the podcast called Resilience Unraveled, and because I'm British, Unraveled has two L's because we
Yeah,
spell it properly.
yeah.
And
There you go.
you have to say,
Yeah,
put my
yeah,
cards on the table. I'm very, very fond of the
yeah,
Americans,
yeah.
and
You
and I
know,
know I know they don't like being teased, but it does them good.
yeah. I'm not American, so it's all good.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, all the teeth. I'm all for it. I'm all for it.
Exactly. So that's what it is. And I'm on LinkedIn as well, so feel free to reach out. Thank you
Perfect.
so
Well,
much, Danny. I
yeah.
really enjoyed
Thank
it.
you. Yeah, thank you. It was a pleasure.